Because these early 80s cars aren't particularly strong shells, I want to put a bit of extra strength in. So the regulations allow for seam welding along all the original seams, in addition to the original spot welds. I want to go through the car strategically and put in some extra strength, particularly left to right. So I'm going to bolt in the seat supports and the roll cage nice and tight, fixing the car in this square position that it's in now, so that the heat from the welding doesn't distort it. The car is supported nice and solidly on axle stands underneath. So I'm tightening in the roll cage and the seat supports and effectively using them as a jig. I'm going to start around the centre of the car with the floor, and then I'll expand this into the engine bay and up to the suspension turrets later, and also from this main hoop back to the rear suspension pickups. And I'll also do some work underneath. It's always been awkward tightening these bolts on these connections in the roll cage because there's not enough space for the socket to sit down around the heads of the bolts or the nuts. So I'm going to do something about it. I've got a spare 17 socket, and I'm using a flat wheel to first flatten and then taper the edge of the socket down to the opening. So now the socket shouldn't slip as I tighten the bolt all the way down. There's 8 bolts like this on the cage, and since it's going to have to come out again and go back in again, it's well worth doing this now. That's much better. It's bad enough that it's hard to find a good position for the spanner behind. But at least we're now not fighting on 2 fronts. And at least I'm putting that bar in the right way around this time. So we're learning as we go along. I had been planning to put the bolts for the final tighten facing up this sort of way, but there'll be washers on here and they'll be a bit too tight to the weld. So I think ultimately I'm going to put the bolts going down. I'm not totally happy that the threads are going to be exposed underneath, but it will look a little bit better on the inside. But I have been favouring function over aesthetics so far in this project, but I think in terms of the way they're going to hold the plates down, it'll be better to put them with the nut on the outside, unfortunately. And because I can't actually remove that original cross member from the car, it'll be good now that I'll be able to use it to bring the strength of those 2 seat supports across the centre of the car. I'll remove these bolts to get space to do that. I can also put strength in where the rear seat meets the tunnel as well. The tunnel, once supported well, will give the car good strength down the centre. I'll remove these 2 grommets for where the heater pipes come in and out of the interior and store them away. Storage is one of the most important things to do in a project like this, and keeping all the bits together to come back onto the car and having them where you can find them eventually. The rules don't allow for the roll cage to be extended forward to the turrets in historic rallying, so the best way for me to bring the strength of the cage forward is to follow these box sections ahead of the cage and up around. On the other side of these areas is where the suspension pickups are. So this is the critical structural core of the car. Taking off the front wheels now, so I can see the other side of where that box section is running in the arch. I'll also be able to tackle it from underneath later. There actually seems to have been some work done on this car on the wheel arch before me, underneath that red paint. I'll investigate that a little bit to make sure it's been done well, but also just take off the paint on the other side to where I'll be welding so I don't get any fires in the wheel arch. Welding up along the A pillar here will strengthen where nearly all the front suspension forces are focused back into the shell. A lot of this would be precautions that would normally go into a car that's been prepared primarily for forestry rallying, but Irish tarmac rallying is bumpy. I'm raising the car to the maximum of the stands now, for a bit of extra space underneath, because I'm going to be doing quite a bit of work under here in the next couple of weeks. Yes, I will be lying down on the job, but I certainly won't be taking any rest. Unfortunately, my garage floor does tilt down to that drain, but I do have those two front stands quite close together, level with each other and in relation to the rear ones. And so the underbody work begins. Just doing the strips across the underneath now, below the original cross member.
I think this is the point where in all the projects I say the top get going.
I will be having an airline shower before I approach the house after this. I'd left the handbrake cables in place going back to the trailing arm, just unhooking them. I'll be removing the whole trailing arm soon. I don't want to be working around anything on this job, so that I get in as deep as I can in terms of cleaning and preparing all surfaces. I've heard of monsters under the bed. I'm glad to be out from under there for another while. And so the weldathon begins. Basic principle of seam welding or stitch welding is you do about 2 centimeters or an inch, and then a gap, and then another 2 centimeters or an inch. I'm doing them kind of on either side of where the original spot welds were, so I'm doing them where there is a gap. I'm following my instincts, I suppose. I guess this is where I really personalize the car. I'm tapping down the two pieces of metal so that they join well. Be careful not to do too much so I don't knock things out of shape and push that misalignment all along. But look here, for instance, there's no fear of doing that here. The pieces are missing each other by about 3 mil in some places or more. Really feels worthwhile doing this. Those two panels weren't even really working together. And look, in fairness to the manufacturer, this could be a crumple zone, but road car safety principles and rally car safety principles are quite different on account of how much more supported you are in well anchored race seats and harnesses. I'm erring on the slightly weaker side of caution in terms of welding strength, because everything I'm doing here is in addition to what's there already, so it's all a bonus. And if I start burning holes in the car, well then I'm taking away. So there's also quite a lot of contaminants with sealants and stuff that, short of having the car chemically dipped, I can't really do anything about. That's not within my budget, so I just got to make the best of what I have and clean up as much as I can. In order to fit the rear lateral support for the driver's seat as far forward as possible, it had to go on to this reinforced area for the original seat support and the handbrake. So I'm welding that continuously all the way around, so it effectively becomes part of the shell. This is a spot where I can really improve the front to back strength, because that sill is meeting the front sections with a join with only about 3 spot welds in it. So welding that continuously will make a big difference. A long stitch between the 2 spot welds on the tabs at the end of the cross member will spread its strength into the sill. This is the back of the wheel arch. There's loads of contaminant in here. I've done my best to clean it out. The 2 seams are really tightly joined, so I don't really want to disturb that, trying to scrape out the sealant. So I'm getting a lot of fires. I'm trying different techniques here. But anyway, I'm definitely adding rather than subtracting. Pulsing the welder in short bursts seems to be working. Some places anyway. Just above where I'm welding at the moment, I'm going to have to do a little repair sometime for where the bonnet pull used to be anchored. This will have to be disabled during motorsport use, but I may leave it in place for times it's parked in public. Now, look at the gap there ahead of the front leg of the roll cage between the floor and this very important box section. I've actually been reading about how during a season where these cars picked up many class wins on the National British Championship in 1981, on the Scottish Rally, Brian Wiggins suffered some failures of spot welds in these areas, and I think you can see how that could have been possible from the gaps I found in the panels here. Thanks to Mark McClellan for digging out that information for me. He's restoring the Astra GTE Mark 1, same generation as this car, that won its class on the 1984 RAC Rally. I did as much of the welding as I could do without removing these supports so as to hold everything in place. Now I've taken them out and I clean up underneath them and continue the welding there. Back to that rear seat support, and I'll continue welding in those reinforcements continuously. So that's most of the seam welding on the floor sections. I'll do the remainder of the bulkhead after I stripped out the last of the engine bay and I'm working on all of that, including the suspension mounts. I may do more on the floor from underneath.